Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, who nursed wounded and sick British soldiers during the Crimean War. A symbol of caring, celebrated on stamps, banknotes, statues, and whose name is a byword for the nursing profession. And yet, what if I told you that Florence Nightingale's greatest achievements were not during, but after the Crimean War? And that during that war, she presided over a hospital whose death rates peaked at 42%, almost half the men she was looking after. And what if I told you that there were other nurses who operated a lot closer to the front line than Florence, and with whom she clashed? Some you may have heard of, like Mary Seacole. But how about Betsi Cadwaladr, Martha Clough, or the formidable nun, Mother Mary Bridgeman? You see, the story of Florence Nightingale is far more interesting than romantic Victorian paintings of the lady with the lamp. And as usual with the History Chap, there are loads more interesting side stories that most people have forgotten, including a French celebrity chef who invented a stove that was to be used by the British Army for over 100 years, and the forgotten contribution of engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel. So sit back as we explore what Florence Nightingale really achieved. The legend versus reality. Florence Nightingale was born on the 12th of May 1820 in the city of Florence, Italy, which is where her name comes from. Her parents, William and Frances Nightingale, were wealthy English gentry on an extended European tour. The family returned to England and settled into a comfortable life, split between two country estates, Embley Park in Hampshire and Lea Hurst in Derbyshire. Florence received an unusually rigorous education for a woman of her era. Her father taught her himself classics, philosophy, mathematics, modern languages, and she showed a particular gift for numbers. At 16, she believed she received a calling from God. She didn't know quite what form it would take, but she was convinced that she had a mission. By her mid-20s, she had identified it: nursing. Her family were horrified. In the 1840s, nursing was not the respectable profession that it is now. Apart from a few religious houses, nurses were generally associated with drunkenness, slovenliness, and loose morals. The popular image was Dickens's Sarah Gamp, who appeared in his story Martin Chuzzlewit. Gin-soaked, incompetent, self-serving, and her equally odious sidekick, Betsy Prigg. It was no career for a gentle Victorian woman. Her mother rejected the idea completely. And for the next 6 years, Florence suffered what she called dreaming, periods of withdrawal and depression, chronic illness, migraines, a near breakdown. By 1847, she was genuinely unwell. Eventually her family relented enough to allow her to travel around Europe. And in 1850, she visited the Institute of Deaconesses at Kaiserwerth in Germany, a Protestant religious community that trained women in nursing and hospital work. She returned for 3 months of formal training in 1851. In 1853, Nightingale finally got her chance to work as a nurse. She became superintendent of the Hospital for Invalid Gentlewomen in Harley Street, London, a small institution caring for governesses and other distressed gentlewomen who'd fallen on hard times. It was as much an administrative post as a nursing one. She reorganised the institution, improved its efficiency, and gained invaluable experience managing a healthcare facility. And later that year, in October 1853, the Crimean War broke out. The war pitted Britain, France and the Ottoman Empire against Russia, and the main theatre of the war that would last until 1856 was the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. Prior to landing in the Crimea, the British and French armies assembled at Varna in modern-day Bulgaria in the summer of 1854. Conditions were appalling. The camps were in marshland. Sanitation was non-existent. 10,000 French soldiers died at Varna, 7,000 from cholera alone. In the smaller British Army, 724 British soldiers died from cholera before a shot was fired in anger. Among the dead was Lauderdale Mall. The 47-year-old Scot had previously been a lieutenant colonel in the 79th Regiment of Foot, the Queen's own Cameron Highlanders, before becoming a Member of Parliament. In 1853, he'd been appointed Surveyor General of Ordnance, and it was in this capacity that he'd travelled to Varna with the British Army. And remember that name, because it will come back to us later in our story. The army eventually crossed the Black Sea to the Crimea, landing in September 1854. And the first major battle, the Battle of Alma, was fought later that month and was an Anglo-French victory. However, it came at a cost. British casualties alone were 362 killed and 1,621 wounded. The wounded were evacuated to hospitals at Scutari, 300 miles away across the Black Sea at the modern-day Istanbul, then Constantinople, in Turkey. And it was there that the scandal began. William Howard Russell, war correspondent for The Times, began sending dispatches home describing the appalling conditions. Indeed, without a single horse-drawn ambulance in their army, it had taken over 2 days simply to remove the British wounded from the battlefield at Alma. And now in a former barracks, designated a hospital, the wounded soldiers, men who'd fought for Queen and country, lay untended in filth with no proper nursing care and a complete lack of basic bedding, clothing, food, let alone medical supplies. "Are there no devoted women among us," Russell demanded, "able and willing to go forth to minister to the sick and suffering soldiers of the East?" The British public was outraged. Pressure mounted on the government to act. On the 15th of October 1854, Sidney Herbert, Secretary of State for War and a personal friend of Florence Nightingale, wrote to her asking if she would lead a party of nurses to the Crimea. Ironically, Florence had read Russell's articles in the newspaper and had decided to take action herself. She wrote to the Secretary of War offering her services, and their letters crossed in the post. Just 6 days later, on the 21st of October 1854, Florence Nightingale left London with 38 nurses. She was just 34 years old. She would return 2 years later as the most famous woman in England, the Lady with the Lamp. But the reality of what happened at Scutari was far more complicated than the legend suggests. One person who didn't accompany her was Athena, her pet owl. Whilst visiting the Acropolis in Greece in 1850, she rescued the little owl, which was being tormented by some boys. For the next 4 years, the owl, which she named Athena, was her constant companion, often being kept in her pocket. She would often peck at visitors and had entertained patients and their families at Harley Street. However, with all the hectic preparation for departure, Athena had accidentally been locked in the attic of the family home in London. So domesticated that she couldn't hunt, and with no access to water, Athena died of starvation. "Poor little beastie," Florence wrote when she found the body. "It was odd how much I loved you." She had the owl stuffed and it remained on display in the family home until the end of her life. Florence Nightingale arrived at Scutari on the 4th of November 1854. The Barrack Hospital was a vast building, a former Turkish military barracks that could hold up to 2,500 patients at capacity. It was also filthy, chaotic and desperately undersupplied. But before Nightingale could change anything, she had to navigate a minefield of military politics. She had not arrived at the request of the army. She was under the orders of the minister, Sidney Herbert. It placed her in a position of no military authority or support, but with considerable political and press influence. And not for the first time or last time in history, such an ambiguous position was a double-edged sword. Furthermore, her official title was, get ready for it, Superintendent of the Female Nursing Establishment of the English General Hospitals in Turkey. That title defined her authority and its limits. She could command female nurses. That was it. She had no authority over the army doctors, no authority over the orderlies, no authority over military administration, and critically, no authority over medical decisions. The doctors reported to the Army Medical Department, and in the Crimea itself, the principal medical officer was Sir John Hall, a man who'd become Nightingale's nemesis. Hall was old school. He resented civilian interference full stop, and he distrusted female nurses, and saw Nightingale as a threat to his authority. Hall summed up the situation in a letter. Miss Nightingale queens it with absolute power, all of the authorities being afraid of the newspapers. Ouch. There was another problem with Nightingale's authority. Her remit covered hospitals in Turkey, basically Scutari and some neighbouring hospitals, but not the Crimea. As the war progressed, hospitals were established in the Crimea, but Hall insisted that those were outside of her specific jurisdiction. It meant that nurses could operate in the Crimea entirely outside of Nightingale's control. And some did exactly that, as you're going to discover in a while. Eventually, Nightingale's authority was extended to the Crimea, well, on paper at least, but Hall continued to obstruct her at every turn, instructing his doctors not to work with her nurses. Despite this turf war with Sir John Hall, Nightingale got to work at Scutari immediately. She found the Barrack Hospital lacking in the most basic supplies. There were no operating tables, insufficient bedding, not enough shirts, socks or utensils. The men lay in their uniforms, still caked with the blood and mud from the battlefield. The official supply system was paralysed by bureaucracy. Requisitions had to go through endless channels. Forms had to be completed in triplicate. Nightingale cut through this red tape. On one occasion, when a military officer refused to release medical supplies from a locked storeroom, she simply took a hammer and broke in. The troops loved it. They started calling her the Lady with the Hammer. It was a name that suited her. Forceful, practical, determined. But William Howard Russell, the Times war correspondent, thought it was too coarse for his readers back home. A woman with a hammer? Smashing down doors? That wasn't the image Victorian Britain wanted. And so Russell gave them something else. In his dispatches, he described Nightingale gliding through the wards at night, lamp in hand, checking on her patients. A ministering angel. The lady with the lamp. It was a powerful image. Feminine, gentle, self-sacrificing. Everything a Victorian heroine should be. The poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, immortalised it in 1857 in his poem, Santa Filomena. Lo, in that house of misery, a lady with a lamp I see, pass through the glimmering gloom, and flit from room to room. The lady with the hammer was quietly forgotten. The lady with the lamp became immortal. She did indeed pass through the wards at night, checking on her patients, but equally importantly, and not reported, checking on the standards of her nurses too. Nightingale was never a particularly hands-on carer. Her strength was as an administrator, setting and ensuring consistently high standards. She was a stickler for discipline, sending nurses she deemed incompetent home, along with those who got, well, too familiar with some of the patients, and those who enjoyed a drink. It was these high standards and her lady with the hammer attitude of, well, basically my way or the highway, which would lead to some of her most publicised clashes with other nurses. And more of that in a little while. Florence was fortunate to also have access to her family wealth, as well as donations from the Times Crimean Fund. She proceeded to purchase shirts, socks, bedding, operating tables, screens to give dying men some privacy, effectively just bypassing the army bureaucracy. Laundries were also established so patients could have clean linen. Nightingale organised the cleaning of the wards, scrubbing floors, whitewashing walls, removing accumulated filth. she created an invalid's kitchen specifically for patients with special dietary needs, appealing food for men too weak for regular rations. This was revolutionary. No one had thought to do this before. In this, she was assisted by Alexis Soyer, the French head chef of the Reform Club in London, a man with a social conscience who arrived in a private capacity to help. He established new recipes and professional kitchens, not just in the hospitals, but with the British Army in the Crimea, where he also invented a portable field stove, the Soyer stove, which the British Army would use for over 100 years. So far, this is the story you know. The saintly nurse battling military incompetence, improving conditions through sheer determination. Although, interestingly, the lamp that she carried, and which is on display in the Florence Nightingale Museum in London, was not the one that the artists back in London painted her with. As Times correspondent Russell didn't actually describe the lamp, artists far away in London were given, well, artistic license to come up with their own designs. And it is these designs, which look like a lantern from Alibaba, rather than the lanterns that you could buy in a Turkish bazaar, that became part of the Florence Nightingale legend. Her practical reforms made a real difference to the comfort and dignity of wounded soldiers. But here's the uncomfortable truth. During that winter of 1854-55, 4,000 patients died at Scutari. In February 1855, 3 months after Nightingale had arrived at the hospital, the death rate at the Barrack Hospital reached 42.7%. Nearly half the men admitted to the hospital were dying on Florence Nightingale's watch. And the men weren't dying of their wounds. They were dying of disease. Cholera, typhus, dysentery. Diseases that spread invisibly through the wards, killing men who'd survived the battlefield only to succumb weeks later. Nightingale, a believer in miasma, the dominant medical theory at the time, the idea that disease was caused by bad air and foul smells, could not understand why, with all her nurses' care, the cleanliness of the wards and her rigid management, the death rates were spiralling ever upwards. In March 1855, at her request, the British government sent a sanitary commission to Scutari to find out why so many men were dying. They were led by Dr. John Sutherland, a man who would become one of Nightingale's closest allies in the years after the war. With him came Robert Rawlinson, a leading civil engineer, and members of the pioneering sanitary department from Liverpool. What the commission found was horrifying. The Barrack Hospital had been built over defective sewers. Sutherland's report to Parliament recorded the grim inventory. During the week, there were collected and removed from the vicinity of the Barrack Hospital 202 handcarts or baskets full of filth, rubbish and offensive matter. The carcasses of 15 dogs and 2 horses were buried. Hardly surprising that 42% of the patients were dying. The Sanitary Commission proceeded to flush out the sewers 3 times, improved ventilation, removed the dead animals from the water supply, and installed proper drainage. Actually, that particular work was conducted by George Jennings, the man who'd invented public flush toilets for the Great Exhibition a few years earlier. The results were dramatic. In February 1855, before the commission arrived, the death rate at Scutari was 42%. By June 1855, 3 months after their work began, it had fallen to 2.2%. Now, that's not to diminish what Nightingale achieved. Her particular reforms mattered. Her advocacy for better supplies, better food, better conditions, all of it helped. And her presence, her determination, her willingness to fight the military establishment. These things mattered too. But the uncomfortable truth remains. The single biggest factor in reducing mortality at Scutari was not the lady with the lamp. It was the men who fixed the sewer. The Barrack Hospital at Scutari was not the only British hospital in the war. Nearby was the smaller General Hospital, also under Nightingale's authority. And then, of course, there were hospitals in the Crimea itself, closer to the fighting. These Crimean hospitals operated, as I said earlier, largely outside of Nightingale's control, whatever her official authority said on paper. There was also one other hospital that we should mention, one that came too late to make the difference that it might have. In February 1855, the British government asked Isambard Kingdom Brunel to design a new kind of hospital. Yes, that Brunel, the engineer behind the Great Western Railway, the SS Great Britain and the Clifton Suspension Bridge, was asked to solve the problem of soldiers dying in filthy hospitals. Brunel designed an entire hospital in just 6 days. It was revolutionary. Prefabricated wooden buildings, manufactured in England, shipped out in pieces, assembled on site. Each ward could hold 50 patients. Clean running water, proper drainage, high windows for ventilation, stoves for warmth. Every element designed to prevent the spread of disease. The hospital was built at Rencoy on the Dardanelles, further south than Nightingale's hospitals at Scutari. The first patients arrived in October 1855. Of the 1,300 patients treated at the hospital, only 50 died. Nightingale called them those magnificent huts. But by then, Sevastopol had fallen and the war was essentially over. Brunel's brilliantly designed hospital came on stream just as the need for it was ending. It's interesting to wonder what might have been achieved if his hospital, or maybe hospitals, had been available from the outset. In May 1855, Nightingale crossed the Black Sea to inspect the hospitals in the Crimea. It was her first visit to the actual war zone, the place that would forever be associated with her name, even though she spent almost all of her time 300 miles away in Turkey. Whilst there, Nightingale contracted Crimean fever, almost certainly brucellosis, a bacterial infection that would plague her for the rest of her life. Such is the powerful emotion and imagery of the lady with the lamp that it's easy to think that Florence Nightingale was the only nurse helping sick and wounded British soldiers during the Crimean War. But the reality was that she wasn't the only nurse even at Scutari, and she wasn't even the only leader. In December 1854, barely a month after Nightingale arrived, a second party of 46 nurses landed. They were led by Mary Stanley, a friend of the Herbert family, and they included 15 Irish nurses, the Sisters of Mercy, under Mother Mary Frances Bridgeman. Mother Bridgeman was as formidable as Florence Nightingale. She had volunteered her nun services to help the wounded, not least the many Irish Catholic soldiers, and simply refused to take orders from Nightingale. The clash between the two women is often portrayed as a religious conflict, Protestant versus Catholic, secular nursing versus religious orders. It wasn't, or at least not primarily. Nightingale actually had excellent relations with other Catholic nuns, not least Mother Mary Clare Moore, who had led the contingent of Bermondsey sisters in Florence's original party. The conflict with Bridgeman was about authority, pure and simple. Nightingale wanted absolute control over all nurses. Bridgeman insisted that her sisters answered to her, their religious superior, not some secular superintendent. Both women were stubborn, capable, and utterly convinced that they were right. Bridgeman and her sisters were eventually moved to a hospital at Balaclava in the Crimea, away from Nightingale's direct supervision. And there, Bridgeman ran what she modestly called the Model Hospital of the East. Nightingale, in her less charitable moments, referred to Bridgeman as Reverend Mother Brickbat. Both women served with dedication throughout the war. Both women returned home exhausted. Neither ever conceded that the other might have been right. But Mother Bridgeman was at least part of the official nursing establishment sent out by Sidney Herbert, even if she did dispute who was in charge of it. other women operated entirely outside of the system. Mary Seacole, you knew she'd make an appearance, was a Jamaican-born daughter of a Creole mother and a white British Army officer from Scotland. Her mother ran a boarding house in Kingston, from where she dispensed various herbal remedies to locals and British soldiers. And it was from her that Mary Seacole learned both those herbal remedies and the entrepreneurial talents of running a guest house. Eventually, she ran her own establishments in both Panama and Jamaica, where she treated patients during several epidemics, most notably treating men of the 97th Regiment of Foot during the Jamaican cholera epidemic in 1850. And they were not the only regiment whom she assisted. Men from the 48th Northamptonshire Regiment also called upon her services when they were based on the island. When the Crimean War broke out, this mixed-race daughter and friend of the British Army immediately decided to go to the war zone. Arriving in London, she applied to join Nightingale's official nursing party, but had missed the recruitment deadline for the first party that Florence herself took to Scutari. Nevertheless, Mary then applied for the second group, the one which included Mother Bridgeman and her Sisters of Mercy. She was rejected by one of Nightingale's deputies. The reasons have been debated ever since. Was it racism, her age, her lack of formal training, lack of well-connected references, the fact that the quota was already full? Probably some combination of all five. But whatever the reason, Seacole would not be deterred. She funded her own passage to the Crimea with a business partner, Thomas Day. Near Balaclava, she established the British Hotel. Her venture couldn't have been more different from Nightingale's at Scutari. Seacole's British Hotel was not a hospital in the style of Scutari. It was a place where officers and soldiers could buy food, drinks, supplies and medical treatment. And for all those services, there was a charge. Mary Seacole never hid the fact that she was a compassionate businesswoman. She treated minor ailments with her herbal remedies, headaches, stomach complaints, the everyday afflictions of soldiers in the field. More serious casualties were sent to the army hospitals. One of the popular legends about Mary Seacole is that, unlike Florence Nightingale, she actually tended troops on the battlefield. By the time she arrived in the Crimea, the three major British battles of Alma, Balaclava and Inkerman had already been fought. Just the siege of Sevastopol continued. In her own memoir, Seacole described going to the battlefields on just 3 separate occasions, bringing food and supplies and treating wounded men. However, it needs to be remembered that when 19th century writers, including Seacole, used the term battlefield, they were talking more about the war zone than actually being in the midst of the battle per se. So it would seem that she went to the battle zone 3 times to treat wounded soldiers, rather than dashing out into no man's land under fire, and Mary Seacole never claimed to have done otherwise. Nevertheless, that was 3 times more than Florence Nightingale. Nightingale, however, was dismissive. In private correspondence, she suggested Seacole ran a bad house, implying it was disreputable, possibly even a brothel. Now, there is no evidence that this was true, but the nature of the establishment, part shop, part canteen, part pharmacy, along with the personality of its owner, probably made the British Hotel a slightly more riotous place than the lime-washed wards of Scutari. The hotel was certainly popular with the British troops, especially those who knew of Seacole from their postings in Jamaica, including the 48th and 97th Regiments who were in Crimea at the time. They called her Mother Seacole. Mary Seacole versus the lady with the lamp. Mixed race herbal healer and businesswoman versus the white, well-connected Uber administrator who believed in modern scientific medicine. No wonder people find their story interesting. Yet the relationship was more complex than simple hostility. When Seacole passed through Scutari en route to the Crimea, she met Nightingale and wrote about the meeting with great warmth. And years later, when Seacole was destitute, Nightingale contributed to a fund to support her. I must admit that I was sceptical about Mary Seacole, so I read her autobiography, Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands, and found it fascinating. Put simply, it's the humble story of a woman with a big heart, and quite frankly, the world needs people like that. I'll put a link in the description for you. But Mary Seacole was not the only British nurse operating in the Crimea itself, nor was she the only one to be operating outside of Nightingale's jurisdiction. There was also Betsi Cadwaladr, Welsh, working class, fiercely independent. Betsi was in her 60s, almost twice the age of Florence. A former domestic servant with no formal training, but decades of practical experience, she arrived with one of the later nursing parties and immediately clashed with Nightingale. The friction was partly social. Nightingale could be high-handed with those she considered her social inferiors. But it was also a clash of methods. Cadwaladr wanted to nurse soldiers directly, hands-on, at the bedside, responding to immediate needs. She had no patience for bureaucracy, forms or hierarchies. Nightingale's system at Scutari was based on exactly those things. Rules existed for reasons. Cadwaladr found it stifling. She requested a transfer to Balaclava, closer to the front, well away from the management systems of Nightingale. Interestingly, when Nightingale later visited Balaclava, she acknowledged the improvements that Cadwaladr had made in her hospital, especially with regards to hygiene standards, writing that Betsi was an active, respectable, hard-working, kind-hearted old woman, with a foul tongue and a cross temper. From Nightingale, that was almost a compliment. Later in the war, Betsi Cadwaladr contracted both cholera and dysentery and was forced to return to England. She never fully recovered, and she died in obscurity in 1860 and was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave in Abney Park Cemetery, London. All she had at the end was her little Welsh Bible given to her as a child. In 2012, the Royal College of Nursing and the Betsi Cadwaladr University Hospital Board funded a memorial stone placed near to where she is thought to be buried. And finally, here is another nurse whom I bet you haven't heard of, Martha Clough. Martha Clough was a lady volunteer, not a professional nurse, not a religious sister, just one of many gentlewomen inspired by Nightingale who offered to become nurses. Martha's motivation was deeply personal. The man she'd loved for nearly 20 years had died of cholera, whilst the army was still at Varna. And his name? Lauderdale Mall. Remember him, the soldier come politician who was the Surveyor General of Ordnance? When he had died, she decided to go to the war herself. Her primary aim was to lay flowers on his grave. Her secondary aim was to nurse the men who'd served alongside him. She arrived independently, not part of any official party, and immediately ran into trouble with Nightingale, who denounced her as a mad freak for simply refusing to submit to her authority. But Clough, whose background, unlike Betsi or Mary Seacole, rivalled Nightingale's, had some powerful friends of her own. She made her way to Balaclava, where within days she was visited by Sir Richard Airy, the Quartermaster General, and also Sir Colin Campbell, commander of the Highland Brigade, the hero of the Thin Red Line at Balaclava, and by the Commander-in-Chief himself, Lord Raglan, who sent her food parcels from his own stores. In February 1855, Campbell, a man whom she confessed if ever she'd been capable of loving again, it would have been him, invited her to serve in a new hospital on the Inkerman Heights. She accepted and became the only nurse in the frontline hospital during the war. At the Highland Brigade Hospital, Martha cared for 40 or more patients at a time without any other nursing support. She cooked more than 120 meals a day. She bathed and dressed the wounded, comforted the dying, and arranged funerals. She wrote letters for men who couldn't write themselves, and sent their belongings home to their families. The senior commanders adored her, Sir John Hall, Nightingale's enemy, noted dryly that Miss Clough deserved to be lauded in the press as much as Miss Nightingale. But no one dares say that publicly. When Nightingale visited Balaclava in May 1855, she made a point of not calling on Martha Clough. It was a deliberate snub, totally at odds with the public perception of the caring lady with the lamp, and it was noticed by the senior commanders. However, such was Nightingale's influence and growing popularity back in Britain, they were powerless to rebuke her. Clough became ill in mid-June 1855, probably from cholera, and died on the 21st of September. She was buried in the cemetery next door to Scutari Hospital. She never did place flowers on Lauderdale Mall's grave at Varna. The Crimean War ended in March 1856, and Florence Nightingale left Scutari after the last patients had departed in the July. Wanting to avoid any public fanfare, she travelled incognito and arrived, walking on foot from the nearby railway station, at her family home in Derbyshire in early August. Despite successfully avoiding the press and the fanfare of the heroine's return, she did accept an invitation to visit Queen Victoria and Prince Albert at Balmoral in the September. The Queen already admired her. The previous year she'd sent Nightingale a brooch designed by Prince Albert, inscribed with the words, "Blessed are the merciful." Over the following days, Nightingale met repeatedly with the Queen and with Lord Panmure, the new Secretary of State for War. Based upon her experiences during the war, she laid out the case for a review and complete overhaul of Army medical services. Panmure, who incidentally was the brother of Martha Clough's great love, Lauderdale Mall, was reluctant. But Victoria supported Nightingale and overruled him. 19th century girl power. The Royal Commission on the Health of the Army was established in May 1857, with Sidney Herbert as chairman. Incredibly, despite being the hero of the hour, Nightingale couldn't testify at the inquiry because she was a woman. So she decided to use her formidable organisational skills behind the scenes, preparing witnesses, writing questions, reviewing answers, and above all, collating, analysing and presenting statistics of deaths at Scutari. In fact, what few people know is that Florence Nightingale was a formidable statistician. She presented those statistics visually in the form of what she called a Coxcomb diagram, and which has become known as polar charts. A circular chart divided into 12 wedges, one for each month. In each wedge, coloured segments showed causes of deaths: wounds in red, preventable disease in blue, other causes in black. At a glance, it told a harrowing story. The blue segments, preventable disease, dwarfed everything else. They peaked in January and February 1855, when mortality at Scutari reached its horrifying maximum. Then they shrank dramatically after the Sanitary Commission's work. And whilst Florence didn't invent them, her use of visual charts at this Royal Commission propelled histograms into the public eye. You didn't need to understand the intricacies of the data or the medical science. The simple visuals, just like modern pie charts, could be easily understood, even by politicians. In January 1858, Nightingale published her findings, with accompanying diagrams, in a report with the pithy title, "Notes on Matters Affecting the Health, Efficiency and Hospital Administration of the British Army." It ran to 853 pages and added impetus to the Royal Commission. Her biographer, Sir Edward Cook, later called it the least known, but perhaps the most remarkable of her works. For this groundbreaking work, she was elected the very first female Fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. The Royal Commission's report led to fundamental reforms. 4 sub-commissions were established, one for sanitary conditions in barracks, one for statistical record keeping, one for a proper Army medical school, and one to reconstruct the entire Army Medical Department. The Army Sanitary Committee, on which Nightingale served as an unofficial advisor, visited every barracks and army hospital in England between 1858 and 1861. 108 barracks, 58 hospitals. They inspected ventilation, sewage disposal, water supplies, washing facilities. The report led to a radical overhaul of the construction and management of army barracks, which saw a dramatic decline in death rates. But success came at a cost. Her own health had been failing ever since that bout of Crimean fever in 1855. And by Christmas 1861, she had suffered a severe collapse. She could barely walk. For the next 20 years, Florence was effectively bedridden, confined to her room in the house in South Street in Mayfair, conducting her campaigns from a couch. Modern diagnosis suggests chronic brucellosis, the disease she'd contracted in the Crimea, possibly compounded by what we'd now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Some historians add guilt to the mix. The psychological burden of having presided over Scutari without understanding what was killing the men until her statistical work afterwards. Whatever the cause, it didn't stop Nightingale's reforming and administrative zeal. Far from it. In 1859, she published Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not, a slim 76-page volume written for anyone caring for the sick at home. Every woman, or at least almost every woman in England, she wrote in the opening, has at one time or another of her life charge of the personal health of somebody, whether child or invalid. In other words, every woman is a nurse. It sold 15,000 copies in the first month, and it has never been out of print since. During the Crimean War, admirers had raised £44,000 in public donations to honour her service, and in 1860 she used that money to establish the Nightingale Training School at St Thomas's Hospital in London. 15 probationers enrolled in a one-year programme that combined theoretical instruction with practical ward experience. They studied anatomy, physiology, chemistry, food sanitation, ethics and professionalism. They wore uniforms and followed a strict professional code of conduct, all designed by Florence. It was the first secular professional nursing school in the world. And the graduates, who were called Nightingales, went on to become matrons at hospitals across Britain and beyond, establishing training schools, raising standards, transforming the profession. And it is for this, and not her Crimean War work, that Florence Nightingale is known as the founder of modern nursing. And still, her mission to improve healthcare continued. Under the Poor Laws, sick paupers in workhouses were cared for by other paupers. No professional nursing, no trained care. The most vulnerable people in society left to the most inadequate treatment. Working with the Liverpool merchant, William Rathbone, she helped establish professional nursing at the Liverpool Workhouse Infirmary in May 1865. This in turn influenced the Metropolitan Poor Act of 1867. Nor was her work limited to Britain. The Indian Mutiny of 1857 had drawn Nightingale's attention to the health conditions in the subcontinent. What she found appalled her. In 1859, 69 soldiers per 1,000 were dying annually in India, not from combat, not from tropical diseases per se, but from sanitary conditions. Young men who had survived the journey all the way out there, survived the climate, survived whatever fighting they encountered, dying in peacetime barracks from contaminated water and inadequate drainage. She was active in the Royal Commission on the Sanitary State of the Army in India, established in 1863. For 40 years she corresponded with officials in India, advising on cholera prevention, drainage, public health. She helped develop sanitation legislation for Bombay, and all without ever visiting the country. And yet, despite all these achievements, her name was still associated with the Crimean War. In 1890, she recorded a message on a special phonograph or gramophone recording to raise money for the remaining survivors of the charge of the Light Brigade. In the brief recording she says, When I am no longer even a memory, just a name, I hope my voice may perpetuate the great work of my life. God bless my dear old comrades of Balaclava and bring them safe to shore. Florence Nightingale. In 1907, King Edward VII awarded her the Order of Merit, the first woman ever to receive the honour. By then she was blind and her mental faculties were fading. The honour came too late for her to fully appreciate it. She died on the 13th of August 1910, peacefully in her sleep, at her home in South Street, Mayfair, aged 90. Her family declined the offer of a burial in Westminster Abbey. Instead, she was buried in the family plot at St Margaret's Church near Embley Park in Hampshire, where she'd grown up. Her gravestone is remarkably modest. No lengthy inscription, no title, no mention of her honours or achievements. Just F.N. and the dates 1820 to 1910. Florence Nightingale continues to be one of the most famous women in British history, appearing on the reverse of the £10 note for 20 years from 1974, the first non-royal woman ever to appear on a British banknote, as well as 2 British postage stamps, and indeed many more around the world. Countless hospital wards bear her name. There's even a Florence Nightingale Museum in London, where amongst the exhibits you can see Athena the Owl. The 12th of May, her birthday, is celebrated as International Nurses' Day, and since 1965 a commemorative service to celebrate that day and Florence has been held in Westminster Abbey, where the Nurses' Chapel is also named in her honour. So what do we make of Florence Nightingale, the legend and the reality? The legend is simple. A gentle Victorian lady, lamp in hand, gliding through the hospital wards at night, comforting dying soldiers. The angel of Scutari, the founder of modern medicine, an icon of selfless feminine virtue. The reality is more complicated and a lot more interesting. For a start, she wasn't a hands-on nurse in the fashion of Betsi Cadwaladr or Mary Seacole. She was an incredible administrator, who for the first time used evidence to underpin nursing. Nor did she attend wounded men under fire actually in the Crimea. Her hospital was over 300 miles away across the Black Sea. And she didn't save all the wounded men who ended up at Scutari, far from it. Despite her best efforts, the death toll in the hospital rose to over 40%, and it only declined when the Sanitary Commission flushed out the sewers. In fact, her greatest achievements and most lasting legacies only came after the war. The Royal Commission that reformed the healthcare in the British Army, improvements in public health, starting with the workhouses, health reforms in India, and the establishment of her nurses' training college. And all achieved whilst bedridden. That is no mean feat. Her Coxcomb diagram not only highlighted the connection between sanitation and hygiene and healthcare, but spurred the use of visual diagrams to highlight health issues, something that is still used today. Moreover, she broke a glass ceiling for women in a Victorian man's world, not simply by establishing a professional career path for women in nursing that had never been there before, but also by becoming the first woman to be admitted to the Royal Statistical Society and the first to receive the Order of Merit. But maybe above all, this prim and proper lady made nursing a respectable career for upper and middle class women to enter into. Gone were the days of Dickensian lower class drunks, and in came properly trained, disciplined nurses whose care was driven by hard scientific evidence rather than sentiment or guesswork. Prior to the Crimean War, there were no formal women nurses supporting the British Army. But the image of the lady with the lamp transformed nursing not only into a respectable career for upper and middle class women to enter, but also proved their value tending wounded soldiers. Within 10 years of the war ending, female nurses were employed at Woolwich and Netley military hospitals. The Army Nursing Service was established in 1881 and was superseded by the Queen Alexandra's Royal Nursing Corps in 1902. That is now part of the Royal Army Medical Service. In total, 218 female nurses served during the Crimean War. 13, including Martha Clough, died of disease whilst there. Just over 40 years later, 2,000 women were to serve as nurses in the Boer War in South Africa. And by the time Arthur George Walker's statue to Nightingale had been unveiled in London in 1915, Britain found herself in the First World War. And during that conflict, over 90,000 women served in the Voluntary Auxiliary Detachment, nearly 40,000 of them as nurses. And they included the Duchess of Sutherland, Vera Brittain, Agatha Christie, and the most high profile of all, Princess Mary, the daughter of King George V. There are now over 800,000 nurses registered in the UK. And by following the standards originally established by Florence Nightingale, they serve in a profession that is a far cry from Dickens's Sarah Gamp and Betsy Prig. As ever in history, legends are powerful and emotive, but the reality is even more interesting. Well, if you've enjoyed this story, then please give me a like or subscribe to my channel. And why not visit the Florence Nightingale Museum in London, or read Mary Seacole's biography. And for those of you who want to support me a bit more, then please consider hitting the member or the super thanks icons below. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing even more stories from British history with you very soon.